On March 15, 2019, 17-year-old Marcus Chen left his high school in Tacoma, Washington, telling his parents he was going to spend spring break at his friend's house. His mother remembered him packing light, just a backpack with some clothes and his journal, the leather-bound notebook he carried everywhere since his therapist suggested writing might help with his anxiety. She kissed him goodbye at 7:30 inches the morning, not knowing it would be 11 months before anyone would see him again. And when they did, he would no longer be the same person who walked out that door. Marcus was a quiet student at Lincoln High School, the kind of teenager teachers described as brilliant but withdrawn. He excelled in mathematics and computer science, often solving problems in ways that surprised even his instructors. But after his older brother died in a car accident the previous summer, Marcus had retreated further into himself. His parents, David and Lynn Chen, watched helplessly as their surviving son spent hours in his room, emerging only for meals and school. The therapist said it was normal grief, that time would help, that the journal writing was a positive sign. No one suspected he was planning to disappear. The friend Marcus claimed to be visiting, Tommy Morrison, later told police that no such plans existed. They had been lab partners in chemistry, but weren't particularly close. When investigators checked Marcus's laptop, they found searches for Olympic National Forest, survival in wilderness, and strangest of all, time perception in isolation. His browser history showed he had spent weeks studying trail maps, weather patterns, and something called temporal dissociation syndrome, a rare psychological condition where people lose their ability to perceive the passage of time correctly. On the morning he left, surveillance cameras captured Marcus at 3 locations. First, at a camping supply store in Tacoma, where he purchased a water filter, dried food, and a basic first aid kit, paying cash he had apparently saved for months. Then at a gas station, where he filled a red plastic container, though he didn't own a car. Finally, at the Greyhound station, where he bought a ticket to Port Angeles, the gateway town to Olympic National Forest. The ticket agent remembered him because he asked an odd question: "How long is forever?" When she looked confused, he clarified he meant the bus ride duration. 2 hours and 40 minutes, she told him. He wrote it in his journal. The bus driver would later testify that Marcus sat in the back, writing continuously throughout the journey. A passenger who sat nearby noticed the peculiar way he wrote, filling each page completely before moving to the next, his handwriting growing smaller as he approached the margins as if he was afraid of running out of space. When the bus arrived in Port Angeles, Marcus was the last to exit, still writing as he walked. From Port Angeles, he somehow made his way to the Hoh Rainforest entrance, one of the most remote sections of Olympic National Park. A ranger recalled seeing a young Asian man with a backpack around 4 p.m., heading toward the backcountry trails despite the late hour. The ranger warned him about the approaching darkness and asked if he had registered for a camping permit. Marcus said he was just going for a short walk, that he would be back before sunset. The ranger watched him disappear into the green tunnel of ancient trees and didn't think about it again until the missing person report came through 3 days later. When Marcus didn't return home after spring break, his parents initially thought he might have extended his stay with Tommy. It wasn't until they called the Morrison family that panic set in. The police were notified on March 24th, 9 days after Marcus had vanished. By then, the trail had gone cold. Security footage showed him entering the forest, but never leaving. His cell phone last pinged off a tower near Lake Crescent before going dark. Search teams with dogs covered miles of trails, but the Olympic wilderness spans nearly 1 million acres, much of it impenetrable temperate rainforest, where a person could disappear forever. The search operation lasted 3 weeks. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the canopy. Ground teams checked every registered campsite and shelter. They found nothing, not even a footprint they could definitively link to Marcus. The dogs lost his scent about 2 miles from the trailhead, near a creek crossing where spring melt had swollen the water. One handler said his dog acted strangely at that spot, whining and refusing to cross. behavior he had never seen before in 15 years of search and rescue work. As weeks turned to months, the official search was called off. Though volunteer groups continued to look on weekends, his parents hired a private investigator who discovered that Marcus had withdrawn $600 from his savings account the week before he disappeared. The investigator also found something the police had missed. Marcus had been visiting online forums about temporal experiments and consciousness exploration in isolation. One post, made under a username traced to Marcus, asked if anyone had experienced time stopping completely while remaining conscious. Several responses mentioned indigenous legends about places in the Olympic forest where time moved differently, though most dismissed these as folklore. David Chen spent every weekend for 6 months driving to different trailheads, posting missing person flyers that grew weathered and faded in the rain. Lin Chen couldn't bring herself to change anything in Marcus's room, leaving his acceptance letter to the University of Washington Computer Science program unopened on his desk. Teachers and classmates held a candlelight vigil. The local news ran the story periodically, always with the same school photo of Marcus, serious-faced and wearing glasses, looking older than his 17 years. Then, on November 18, 2019, 8 months after Marcus vanished, 2 elk hunters named Jim Garrett and his son Paul were tracking a bull through an area of the forest far from any maintained trail. The terrain was so difficult, they were considering turning back when they stumbled upon something that shouldn't have existed. A game trail that looked deliberately maintained, branches cut cleanly and recently. Following it led them deeper into a grove of massive cedar trees, some over 1,000 years old. That's when they saw the cabin. It was more of a shelter than a proper cabin, built against a massive fallen tree using salvaged materials and covered with moss and ferns that made it nearly invisible. Smoke drifted from a hole in the roof. Jim called out, thinking they had found an illegal marijuana growing operation or a fugitive's hideout. When no one answered, they approached carefully. Through a gap in the wall, they could see a figure sitting at a makeshift table, writing by candlelight. The figure didn't respond to their calls, didn't even look up. It was only when Paul peered closer that he gasped in recognition. He had seen the missing person flyers. It was Marcus Chen. When they entered the shelter, Marcus didn't flee or show surprise. He continued writing, and what they could see was a journal, one of many stacked beside him. Jim would later tell investigators that the boy looked relatively healthy, thin but not emaciated, clean-shaven, wearing clothes that seemed handmade from various fabrics. But it was his behavior that unsettled them. He acknowledged their presence with a nod but kept writing, his hand moving mechanically across the page. When Paul looked over his shoulder, he saw the same thing written over and over. The 15th of March 2019. The 15th of March 2019. The 15th of March 2019. The entire page was filled with that single date. Jim tried to talk to him, asking if he was Marcus Chen, if he was hurt, if he knew people were looking for him. Marcus responded to each question the same way. "It's still March 15th. I'm waiting for tomorrow." His voice was calm, matter of fact, as if stating something obvious. When they told him it was November, he shook his head and pointed to his journal. "I've been keeping track. It's been March 15th for," he paused, counting something on his fingers, "for about 8 hours now, maybe 9. Hard to tell without the sun." The hunters were deeply disturbed. They convinced Marcus to come with them, though he insisted on bringing his journals, 23 volumes in total, each filled cover to cover with writing. The hike back to their truck took 4 hours, during which Marcus occasionally stopped to write the date and time in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. The 15th of March 2019, 2:15 p.m. The 15th of March 2019, 2:30 p.m. Even though the sun was setting and their phones clearly showed it was November evening, at the hospital in Port Angeles, doctors found Marcus in surprisingly good physical condition, considering his months in the wilderness. He had lost weight, but showed no signs of severe malnutrition or disease. Psychological evaluation was another matter. Dr. Sarah Kim, the attending psychiatrist, noted that Marcus exhibited a complete temporal dissociation. He genuinely believed no time had passed since March 15th. When shown a calendar, newspaper, or even video of current events, he would study them carefully, then explain they must be elaborate forgeries, part of what he called the consistency test. His parents' reunion with him was heartbreaking. Lin Chen sobbed when she saw him, but Marcus seemed puzzled by her emotional reaction. "I've only been gone a few hours," he told her. "I said I'd be back by dinner, and technically, it's still the same day." When David Chen showed him photos from the search efforts, the vigils, the months of anguish, Marcus studied them with detached interest, like a scientist examining data that didn't fit his hypothesis. The journals were the most disturbing element. The first few contained relatively normal entries about his planned experiment, as he called it. He wrote about his theory that time was a construct maintained by social consensus, that isolation from human contact and timekeeping devices might allow consciousness to step outside the temporal stream. But as the entries progressed, they became increasingly focused on the single date, pages and pages of the 15th of March 2019, written in various styles, sizes, and patterns. Some pages contained calculations attempting to prove that no time was passing. Others held elaborate diagrams showing how the sun's movement was an illusion, how the seasons changing were perceptual errors. Dr. Kim brought in specialists, including Dr. Robert Hayes, a neurologist who had studied temporal perception disorders. Brain scans showed unusual activity in Marcus's suprachiasmatic nucleus, the part of the brain that regulates circadian rhythms. More concerning was decreased activity in areas associated with episodic memory formation. It was as if his brain had stopped creating new temporal memories while maintaining perfect recall of everything else. He could describe in detail every book he had read in the shelter, every meal he had prepared, every storm that had passed over, but insisted all these events had occurred within a single day. The shelter itself became a subject of investigation. Forest Service personnel who examined it found an impressive structure built with surprising sophistication. Marcus had created a water collection system, a preserved food cache, even a primitive heating system using stones and channeled smoke. The walls were insulated with layers of moss and bark. Most remarkably, he had carved an elaborate calendar system into the fallen tree, but every single day was marked as the 15th of March 2019, distinguished only by subtle symbols that seemed to indicate different versions of the same date. Among his possessions were books he had somehow acquired, though he claimed they had always been there. These included texts on temporal physics, consciousness studies, and indigenous myths of the Olympic Peninsula. One book, particularly worn, contained stories of the Stuck People, a legend from local tribes about individuals who became trapped in single moments, living the same day endlessly until they forgot any other day had ever existed. Anthropologists confirmed these were authentic legends, though rarely recorded in such detail. Marcus's case attracted attention from researchers worldwide. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Stanford flew in to examine him, bringing a team studying temporal perception in isolation. They conducted experiments showing Marcus could accurately judge short time intervals, seconds and minutes, but completely failed to perceive longer durations. When asked to estimate how long he had been in the hospital, he consistently answered about 6 hours, regardless of whether he had been there for days or weeks. Yet he could learn new information, form new memories, and engage in complex reasoning. The disconnect seemed specific to temporal perception. The media attention was intense, but carefully managed by the hospital. Marcus's story sparked debates about consciousness, time perception, and the nature of reality. Online forums dissected his journals, finding patterns and coded messages. Some claimed he had discovered something profound about the nature of time. Others insisted he had simply suffered a psychotic break. A documentary crew received permission to interview him, but the footage was unsettling. Marcus spoke eloquently about his experience, describing how he could feel time pooling around him like standing water, how each moment stretched infinitely while paradoxically never advancing to the next. Treatment attempts yielded mixed results. Medication had no effect on his temporal perception, though it did reduce his compulsion to write the date. Cognitive behavioral therapy sessions became surreal exercises, where therapists tried to prove the passage of time to someone who experienced all evidence as part of an elaborate present moment. Dr. Kim noted that Marcus wasn't delusional in the traditional sense. He didn't hallucinate or show paranoid thinking. His reasoning was logical within his perceived framework. He simply existed in a different temporal reality than everyone else. His parents struggled with how to help him. They brought photo albums, videos of family events, anything to anchor him to the flow of time. Marcus would engage with these materials thoughtfully, but ultimately conclude they were projections of potential futures or fabricated pasts. He maintained that his brother was still alive, that the accident hadn't happened yet, or rather, existed in a parallel timeline he wasn't part of. This belief seemed to bring him comfort, though it devastated his parents. After 6 weeks in the hospital, Marcus was transferred to a specialized facility in Seattle that dealt with rare neurological conditions. The journey there became another strange chapter in his story. Despite being shown the route, watching the landscape change, seeing different cities pass by, he insisted they had been driving in circles, that the scenery was being rearranged to create an illusion of movement. He kept checking his watch, a digital one the hospital had given him, but claimed it was malfunctioning because it showed different times, while clearly still being the same moment. At the Seattle facility, Marcus met other patients with temporal perception disorders, though none as severe as his. One woman experienced days as minutes, aging rapidly in her mind, while her body remained synchronized with standard time. Another man could only form memories in 3-hour chunks, his life a series of disconnected segments. But Marcus remained unique in his complete arrest at a single point in time. The other patients found him unsettling, saying being around him made them feel unstuck themselves. Researchers developed new theories about his condition. Some proposed he had experienced a severe traumatic response to his brother's death, his mind refusing to move forward into a reality where that loss was permanent. Others suggested his intentional isolation and focused meditation on temporal perception had actually achieved what he set out to do, stepping outside normal time flow, but becoming trapped in the process. Brain scans continued to show unusual patterns, particularly during sleep, when most temporal processing occurs. Marcus claimed he didn't dream anymore, or rather, that his dreams were indistinguishable from waking, because both existed in the same eternal moment. The most disturbing development came when Marcus began to influence others' temporal perception. Staff members who spent extended time with him reported feeling disoriented about time passage. One nurse documented checking her watch obsessively after shifts with Marcus, unable to believe hours had passed. Dr. Kim experienced a particularly unsettling episode where she became convinced their therapy session had just started, despite having notes from 2 hours of conversation. These effects were subtle and temporary, but they suggested Marcus's condition might be more than purely psychological. His journals from the forest were analyzed by linguists and psychologists. They found that his language had evolved in unusual ways, developing new tenses to describe actions occurring within an eternal present. He wrote about sideways happenings and depth moments, concepts that seemed to represent his unique temporal experience. Some entries contained mathematical proofs, attempting to demonstrate that linear time was a mass delusion. Others held poetry describing the beauty of an endless now, how he could see every raindrop frozen in space, could walk between the seconds like moving through rooms in a house. 5 months into treatment, Marcus made an unexpected request. He wanted to return to the forest, to the shelter he had built. He claimed he had left something important there, something that would help others understand. Despite concerns, Dr. Kim advocated for the trip, believing it might provide breakthrough insight into his condition. A small team was assembled: Dr. Kim, a forest ranger, Marcus's parents, and Marcus himself. The journey back to the shelter became a surreal pilgrimage into Marcus's transformed reality. Finding the shelter again proved difficult. Marcus insisted the forest had rearranged itself, that the trees were in different positions, but eventually they located it, unchanged, except for animal intrusions. Marcus went directly to a hidden compartment in the floor that investigators had missed. Inside was another journal, this one different from the others. Instead of dates, it contained what Marcus called his real work, page after page of intricate diagrams showing time as a three-dimensional object that could be viewed from outside. Mathematical equations that professors would later confirm were remarkably advanced, describing temporal mechanics in ways that challenged conventional physics. But the most significant discovery was the final entry, written in a different hand than Marcus's usual style, though he insisted he had written it. It was addressed to himself, or rather, to all the versions of Marcus existing in this moment. It described how he had achieved what he sought, had stepped outside time's flow, but warned that return might be impossible. The entry ended with a question: if you could live forever in a single perfect moment, would that be paradise or prison? Below this was written, the 16th of March, 2019, the only reference to a different date in all his journals. When shown this entry, Marcus studied it with confusion. He didn't remember writing it, couldn't explain the different date. For the first time since being found, he showed uncertainty about his temporal position. Dr. Kim saw this as a potential breakthrough, a crack in his temporal fixation. But over the following days, Marcus integrated this anomaly into his worldview, deciding it was a message from a perpendicular self, another version of him existing in an adjacent timeline. The return to Seattle was marked by a change in Marcus's behavior. He began acknowledging that others experienced time differently, though he maintained his own perception was equally valid. He started what he called translation work, attempting to explain his temporal experience in terms others could understand. These sessions were recorded and became valuable resources for researchers studying consciousness and time perception. He described existence as a vast painting where most people could only see one brushstroke at a time, moving from left to right, while he could see the entire canvas at once but couldn't move through it. His parents gradually adapted to their son's condition, though the pain never fully subsided. They visited weekly, each time greeted by Marcus as if they had just arrived, no matter how many visits had occurred. Lin Chen began keeping her own journal, documenting changes in Marcus that he couldn't perceive himself. She noted that despite his temporal arrest, he was maturing emotionally, developing insights and wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond linear experience. David Chen focused on practical matters, ensuring Marcus's medical care was funded, managing the media attention that periodically resurged. A year after his discovery in the forest, Marcus remained institutionalized, but had become something of a phenomenon in neuroscience circles. Papers were published about his case. Conferences featured presentations on Chen syndrome, as some researchers called it. But Marcus himself seemed uninterested in his scientific significance. He spent his days writing, not dates anymore, but elaborate descriptions of his eternal moment, how it contained infinite depth and detail, how he could explore it endlessly without ever exhausting its content. Dr. Kim continued working with him, though their sessions had evolved into something more like philosophical dialogues than traditional therapy. She had come to believe that Marcus might not be ill in the conventional sense, that perhaps he had indeed discovered something about the nature of time and consciousness, even if that discovery had trapped him. In her private notes, she wrote, "We assume our perception of time is correct, and his is disorder. But what if we're both right? What if time is far stranger than we imagine, and Marcus has simply gotten stuck in one of its many possible configurations?" The other temporal perception patients at the facility formed an unusual community around Marcus. Despite their different conditions, they seemed to understand each other in ways the staff couldn't fully grasp. They would sit together in the common room, each experiencing time differently, yet somehow communicating across their temporal divide. One patient described it as a conversation happening at different speeds that somehow still makes sense. Marcus became a strange sort of anchor for them, his absolute temporal fixation providing a reference point for their own drifting perceptions. 18 months after being found, Marcus made another unexpected statement. During a routine session with Dr. Kim, he suddenly said, "It's almost March 16th. When pressed, he couldn't explain what he meant, only that he could feel something approaching, a boundary or transition he hadn't noticed before. The staff prepared for a potential breakthrough or crisis, monitoring him closely. But as the days passed, nothing changed. Marcus continued insisting it was March 15th, 2019, continued his writing and drawing, continued existing in his eternal moment. Yet, subtle changes were observed. His writings began incorporating future tenses he had previously avoided. He started asking about world events, though he still interpreted them as parallel possibilities, rather than actual occurrences. Most significantly, he began sleeping normally again, and staff reported he was dreaming. When asked about his dreams, Marcus described them as windows into the time stream, briefly experiencing linear time before waking back into his eternal present. Dr. Hayes, the neurologist, proposed a radical theory. Perhaps Marcus's brain had developed a new form of temporal processing, one that might be advantageous in certain circumstances. He pointed to Marcus's extraordinary memory for everything that occurred within his perceived single day, his ability to hold vast amounts of information in immediate consciousness, his unusual mathematical insights about temporal mechanics. What if, Hayes suggested in a controversial paper, Marcus represents not a disorder, but an evolution, a new way of experiencing reality that we're not equipped to understand. This theory sparked fierce debate in the scientific community. Critics argued it romanticized what was clearly a severe dissociative disorder. Supporters pointed to the unexplained effects Marcus had on others' temporal perception, the advanced mathematics in his journals, the fact that his condition didn't follow any known psychological or neurological pattern. The debate raged in journals and conferences, while Marcus himself remained oblivious to it, or rather, experienced it all as simultaneous rather than sequential events. His high school held a graduation ceremony where they awarded Marcus his diploma in absentia. His parents accepted it on his behalf, though when they showed it to him, Marcus smiled and said, "But I haven't taken my finals yet. They're not until June." It was moments like these that broke their hearts anew, reminders that their son was both present and forever absent, existing alongside them, but in an entirely different temporal reality. The documentary about Marcus aired nationally, sparking widespread fascination with his story. Viewers were particularly struck by footage of him in the facility's garden, moving through space normally but describing how he could see every position the sun had held and would hold all at once, like a time-lapse photograph experienced as a single moment. He spoke eloquently about the burden and beauty of eternal presence, how loneliness wasn't possible when every moment of connection existed simultaneously, how loss couldn't occur when nothing ever truly passed. Online communities formed around Marcus's writings, attempting to decode his temporal mathematics and philosophy. Some claim to have achieved similar states through meditation or psychedelic experiences, though none matched the completeness of Marcus's condition. Others saw him as a prophet or warning about the dangers of transcending ordinary consciousness. A few individuals attempted to replicate his experiment, isolating themselves in wilderness areas, though authorities quickly intervened when they were reported missing. 3 years after his discovery, Marcus's case took another unexpected turn. During a routine EEG, technicians noticed his brain patterns had begun showing subtle rhythmic variations they hadn't seen before. These patterns seemed to follow a roughly 24-hour cycle, suggesting his brain was beginning to re-establish circadian rhythms despite his conscious experience remaining frozen. "Doctor," Kim wondered if this might represent the beginning of a slow recovery, or perhaps his brain adapting to maintain both temporal experiences simultaneously. Marcus himself reported no change in his perception, still writing the 15th of March 2019, still insisting only hours had passed since he left home. But his behavior showed increasing sophistication in navigating a world that moved through time while he remained still. He learned to predict others' behaviors based on what he called probability shadows, patterns he could perceive in his eternal moment that suggested likely future actions. This ability was tested and confirmed, though no one could explain how he could predict future events while denying the existence of a future. His shelter in the Olympic Forest became an unofficial pilgrimage site, though the Forest Service tried to discourage visitors. People left offerings, notes, questions for Marcus they hoped he might somehow answer. The shelter itself began to decay, but someone always seemed to repair it, maintaining it as a monument to Marcus's journey outside time. Rangers reported strange experiences in the area, feelings of temporal distortion, though scientists who investigated found no measurable anomalies. Marcus's younger sister, Amy, who had been only 12 when he disappeared, was now preparing for college herself. She visited him regularly, the only person besides his parents who did so consistently. She had developed her own way of communicating with him, entering his eternal present rather than trying to pull him into linear time. Their conversations were recorded as part of his treatment documentation, revealing a deep sibling bond that transcended temporal perception. Amy later wrote in her college application essay that her brother had taught her that love exists outside time, that connection doesn't require shared temporal experience. Researchers from MIT gained permission to conduct an ambitious experiment with Marcus. They created a virtual reality environment that could manipulate temporal cues, speeding up and slowing down time indicators to see how Marcus would respond. The results were extraordinary. While Marcus continued to perceive himself in the 15th of March 2019, he could navigate the virtual environment's changing timescales perfectly, as if operating on multiple temporal levels simultaneously. This suggested his brain was processing time normally at some level, but his consciousness was selecting a single moment to inhabit. The experiment led to new theories about consciousness and time. Perhaps, researchers proposed, consciousness naturally exists outside temporal flow, and what we experience as time passing is actually consciousness choosing to move through temporal coordinates. Marcus, in this model, had simply stopped choosing to move, becoming stuck at a single coordinate, while retaining the ability to perceive all others. This theory, while speculative, offered the first framework that could explain all aspects of his condition. As the 5th anniversary of his disappearance approached, Marcus's family prepared for another March 15th, knowing that for Marcus, it would be the same March 15th he had been living for years. But something unexpected happened. On March 14th, 2024, Marcus asked Dr. Kim what tomorrow's date would be. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged the possibility of a tomorrow. When she told him it would be March 15th, he smiled and said, "A different one or the same one?" She asked him what he meant, but Marcus couldn't or wouldn't elaborate. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. Staff observed him writing frantically in a new journal, filling page after page with text too small to read without magnification. When morning came and Dr. Kim arrived for their session, she found Marcus standing by the window, watching the sunrise. "It's beautiful," he said. "I've never seen this one before." When she asked if he meant this particular sunrise, he nodded. March 15th, 2019 didn't have a sunrise like this. This must be a different day. The room fell silent as everyone present realized what they were witnessing. Marcus was acknowledging the passage of time. But the breakthrough was partial. Marcus accepted that time had passed, but insisted he had experienced it all as a single, incredibly dense moment that was only now beginning to unfold in his perception. He described it like a compressed file expanding, revealing the individual days that had been stacked inside his eternal March 15th. He could now see that years had passed, but he experienced them as layers within the same day, rather than as sequential events. This new phase of his condition fascinated researchers even more than his original state. Marcus could now discuss past and future, but in ways that suggested he perceived them as spatial rather than temporal dimensions. He would say things like, "The 2020 that's behind the morning," or "the evening where 2023 lives." His temporal perception had evolved into something unprecedented in medical literature. Neither normal nor fully dissociated, but something entirely novel. Dr. Kim worked with Marcus to develop a vocabulary for his experience, creating terms that could bridge his perception with standard temporal understanding. They called these temporal bridges, linguistic constructs that allowed Marcus to communicate about time while maintaining his unique perspective. Through these bridges, Marcus was able to explain that he hadn't been delusional or confused. He had been experiencing time in a fundamentally different way, one that might be more accurate to time's true nature than linear perception. His journals from this period were eventually published in a scientific anthology, though they required extensive annotation to be comprehensible. Physicists found his mathematical descriptions particularly intriguing, as they seemed to anticipate certain aspects of quantum temporal mechanics that were only beginning to be theorized. One physicist commented that Marcus's equations looked like they were written by someone who could see time from outside, describing its shape and structure in ways impossible for those trapped within its flow. The medical facility where Marcus lived became a research center focused on temporal perception disorders. Marcus himself became a sort of teacher, helping other patients understand their own conditions through his unique perspective. He developed techniques for temporal navigation, ways of maintaining consciousness continuity across different time perception states. These techniques proved valuable, not just for patients, but for researchers studying consciousness and time. As this story is being documented, Marcus remains in treatment, though the word treatment seems increasingly inadequate. He is less a patient being treated for a disorder and more a pioneer exploring a different mode of consciousness. His parents have found peace with his condition, understanding that their son has not lost his mind, but has found a different one. They visit him in his eternal moment, sharing presence, if not temporal progression. The question of whether Marcus will ever fully return to linear time remains open. Some researchers believe his brain is slowly reintegrating temporal processing, that eventually he will rejoin the standard time stream. Others think he has permanently altered his consciousness, that he will always experience time differently than the rest of us. Marcus himself seems unconcerned with the question, as he told Dr. Kim in a recent session, "Whether I'm moving through time or time is moving through me doesn't matter. Either way, we're together in this moment, and this moment contains everything." His story has challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, time, and reality. Conferences are held annually to discuss the implications of Marcus Chen's condition, though they've yet to agree on whether it should be classified as a disorder, an ability, or something beyond current categorical frameworks. Philosophy departments debate whether Marcus has achieved a state sought by mystics throughout history or has simply found a unique way to be lost. Neuroscience continues to study his brain, finding new anomalies that suggest human consciousness might be far more flexible in its relationship to time than previously imagined. The Olympic Forest, where Marcus spent his 8 months outside time, has returned to its ancient silence. The shelter has been removed. The paths he carved have been reclaimed by undergrowth. But rangers and hikers still report strange experiences in that area, moments where time seems to pause or stretch, where the eternal present Marcus discovered seems to linger in the air between the massive trees. Some say it's suggestion, others wonder if Marcus left something behind, a rupture in temporal perception that affects sensitive individuals. Marcus continues to write, his journals now filling a library shelf at the facility. He no longer writes the same date repeatedly, but instead creates elaborate maps of his temporal experience, showing how all moments exist simultaneously in what he calls the eternal now. These maps have become objects of study, with mathematicians and physicists finding in them suggestions of temporal structures that challenge our understanding of time's nature. Whether Marcus Chen is a casualty of grief-induced dissociation, a pioneer of consciousness exploration, or something else entirely, remains a question without a clear answer. What is certain is that his journey into the Olympic forest on March 15, 2019, began something that hasn't ended, may never end, or perhaps exists in a state where beginnings and endings are meaningless constructs. In his own words, written in his latest journal, "I went looking for a way out of time because I couldn't bear to move forward into a world without my brother. What I found was that time isn't a river carrying us forward, but an ocean we can choose to swim in or simply float upon. I chose to float, and in floating, discovered that every moment contains every other moment, that loss is impossible when nothing ever truly passes. I am 17 and I am 22. I am in the forest and I am in this room. It is March 15th, 2019, and it is today, and it is forever, and it is now."